You're listening to a Frequency Podcast Network production.
There's no real sensitive way to put this, and I know because everyone who tried learned that quickly. But when Maui was devastated by a fire in early August, or resorts in British Columbia were evacuated, or when a hurricane, like right now, descends on Florida, well, there are a lot of people who have vacations booked for those places. This episode is not an attempt to take our focus and relief efforts away from people who have lost lives, who have lost family, who have lost everything, and need help and support. But as these extreme weather events become more common in places that rely on tourism for a huge chunk of their economy, what happens? As the median temperatures rise across the globe, when does a hot getaway become a too hot getaway? When the boardwalk that a locale features in tourism ad campaigns every year ends up underwater, what happens then? The places most vulnerable to the frontline impact of the climate crisis are also places that absolutely need a continuous influx of vacationers. And that might soon no longer be something they can count on. What happens to tourism in the climate era? I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Daniel Scott is a professor of geography and environmental management at Waterloo University. Among other things, he researches climate change and tourism. Hi, Daniel.
Good morning, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. It must be a very interesting time in the field of climate change and tourism.
Yeah, this summer I think has really got people's attention. The sort of litany of events and that we've had extremes in North America, the US, South, Europe, China, I think has really galvanized people's attention to the types of impacts it has on tourism, particularly in the high season in the summer.
Well, let's start with a really, really big picture, and then maybe we can zoom in on some individual events or impacts. Just in general, can we quantify how important, how big the tourism industry is to the global economy? Like how much money, how many people depend on it?
Yeah, no, that's something, a really important thing for people to know, that it really matters globally, and it matters a lot, even more so in certain parts of the world. So before COVID, so 2019 is our last sort of uninterrupted year. Tourism was roughly about 10% of the global economy in terms of GDP, and roughly about the same in terms of jobs. So, 1 in 10 people around the world had at least part of their livelihood related to tourism. And it's the largest voluntary transfer of wealth around the globe. So it really matters for some of the countries, developing countries like the Caribbean, for example, some of the islands there, tourism's worth 25%, 50%, even 75% of GDP and jobs. So when COVID decimated tourism for a couple of years, their country credit ratings went down, their borrowing costs went up, their debt went up because the money wasn't coming in to pay for education, healthcare, and all the other things that a country needs to run.
How volatile is this sector right now? You just mentioned the impact of COVID. I know people have started traveling again en masse, but how shaky is the ground underneath the tourism industry's feet, I guess?
Yeah. Tourism faces a number of different mega trends from COVID, potentially a next pandemic, but real challenges related to some of the structural challenges that COVID brought in terms of the economy. They're past the sort of health risk challenges right now. What they're really struggling with is staffing their human resources. And we saw that whether it's Toronto's airport and the ability to get screening, people in, baggage handling, those sort of logistics at Toronto were, and other Canadian airports, and Frankfurt was awful at the beginning of the summer. So they weren't able to staff up, and smaller companies, the same sort of thing. They have a real challenge getting hospitality staff. I've traveled to a few places in Manitoba and sort of central Ontario, and Some restaurants are only open certain days because they just cannot get staff. So they weren't ready or prepared for this large surge of people coming back post-COVID travel. And they haven't been able to get back to the place they were in 2019 in terms of staffing and some of the other parts of tourism economy.
As we look towards the future, and even just regarding the kind of extreme weather that we've seen in so many places this year, where will the changing climate impact on tourism be felt the hardest?
In terms of the hardest, we actually looked at exactly that question. We did a global analysis, I think, of 181 countries or something, using 20 different indicators of the different types of impacts, whether that be flooding or fires, heat waves, the things we saw this summer. And the countries that were most at risk were small island developing states. So that would include the Caribbean, but Pacific Islands and some others who are really reliant on tourism in terms of their economy and employment. But they get a series of compounding impacts. They get hurricanes of various types, different strengths. Sea level rise is a challenge, water security for them. And the cost to travel there, a lot of from an airline's perspective, the fuel costs, the electricity costs, they run on diesel. So some of the areas of the world where we expect tourism to grow the strongest, including Southeast Asia, were some of the ones most at risk. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we had countries like Canada or Scandinavian countries where the impacts can be a mixed bag. There can be some positive, changes in terms of our green season. Our summer season gets a little bit longer for things like boating or golf or things like that. But as well as negative impacts. You see that in the fires, particularly out west and in the north this year. So Canada has, in some cases, some market opportunities, even where it has risks, because our ski tourism is less at risk than, say, California or parts of New England or even Austria and some other parts of the world. So we're sort of in that mixed category, but some of the small island developing states, there's really no upside to it.
I want to ask this sensitively because obviously it's the loss of life and homes and possessions that matter most here. But in a place like Maui that depends on tourism and we see the absolute decimation that we saw earlier this summer, like what happens in the aftermath? And I'm not even here just talking about, when FEMA is in there of finding places for people to stay and supporting them, but just in terms of the economy in like the months and years ahead for the people that rely on it. Like what's Maui going to be like for the next few years or more?
That's a really important question, and something that when I've given advice to destinations or to governments, I always said, plan ahead, have a climate change adaptation strategy because, the day may come, whether it's a fire in Maui or a severe hurricane that hit Bahamas, you want to know what your vision post-disaster is. If there's things that you change, whether it's less tourism, different types of tourism, the structures, the infrastructure that you'd put back into place, all of those sorts of things. If you have an idea of what that looks like ahead of this event, and you always hope it never happens, but when it does, and you engage in that process of building back better, at least you have a plan to start with it, because the money from whether it's FEMA or disaster recovery is usually only there for a couple of years, if it's even there that long. And so you have a small window of opportunity to make some really good changes in your community that, whether that involves tourism or you choose not to, that's up to the community. But the more time they've had to have their voice ahead of time, the better that is. And part of that should always be, in the shorter term, when we have these disasters go on, tourists are often highly at risk because you're visiting an area, you're not attuned to local media where a lot of the warnings and hazards are. And often there's language barriers, Canadians traveling in Greece or other places where the heat wave and the fire is coming over the mountainside, you may have had no idea because you weren't tuned into the local media where those sort of warnings were issued. So better communication in the short term, but then having that longer term vision of how you might build back differently is an important thing for most destinations to have, particularly highly vulnerable ones.
On a more micro level, just in terms of logistics, a lot of people were really upset and offended, and I can see why when right in the aftermath of the Maui fires or in the middle of, I guess, some of the fire warnings out west, some publications were, publishing, I guess, here's what to do if you had a Hawaiian vacation planned, or here's what to know if you're heading out towards the Okanagan. And it's seen as totally insensitive to put those things out there. But what happens to people who have already planned to travel to these regions? And I'm asking here in terms of like how the industry shifts as these things become more common. What do people need to know, I guess, or how will they adapt to planning vacations in the climate era?
Again, that's sort of a billion trillion dollar question of how tourists will respond. In the shorter term, those sort of media outlets should be giving advice to just stay out of the way.
Yeah,
we'll resolve your refunds or those sort of things, but just keep people out of central BC, keep them out of first responders' way, keep them out of the way of the residents so that people can focus on helping residents recover, and keep them out of hotels. Because often when you have disasters, whether it's fires or flood season, talking to some people in the hotel industry, that's a demand driver for them because they know come spring or in the summer, there will be people dislocated out of their homes and they're there to help accommodate them. So we don't want tourists competing for those limited accommodations. How people will respond, that is something that I would really like to see the tourism industry do more on, because we have, as you mentioned, more and more of these sort of events happening over the summer. And each one of these is a learning opportunity for destinations, for the tourism sector as a whole. And they're not really analyzing, what did cancellations look like? What was the timing of those? What kind of information did tourists need to make the right decisions? What kind of adaptation strategies worked, in a fire context? And what I've heard, some people doing now is sort of hedging their bets. When you're making your summer plans, people will actually book hotels or accommodations in two different locations. So maybe one in Spain and one in Greece, because often they'll have 48-hour, 2 days, 3 days cancellation policy, or you can buy that for a couple dollars and you can hedge your bets and see, well, is there a heat wave or is there a fire problem in Spain or Greece this coming summer? And if they're driving or if they're flying, the flights, if the airport's open, generally it's okay to go there. So some people are doing, taking that kind of strategy.
What does that do for the destinations, though, when you've got all these extra bookings? That some of them are just going to be canceled.
Yeah, and so that is the plan of people. And so that is something I think that the industry is going to have to get their head around. How do you grapple with this? And the reason people do that is, if you had booked a holiday to Spain and there's fires, well, you can't rebook somewhere else because it's already full, right? So you couldn't then decide, well, I'm going to go to Greece or Malta or something else because they're packed too. So that's why people, take that strategy. But you're right. But, if there was a problem there, realistically, there's a whole lot of people that are going to be canceling because there's a heat wave or fires or something else anyway. So, and we may not want them there. So in some respects, it's probably okay. But it's something that, hotels and others will need to understand more. How often is this happening?
In terms of the companies providing, flights and hotels and those kind of packages and offering, I guess, the 48-hour type of cancellation insurance you just mentioned. We did an episode on climate and insurance in terms of like homes and property a couple weeks ago. And, it's a risk-reward equation for these companies, right? And that's how they make their money. What happens as the balance shifts? Does the cancellation insurance become more expensive? Does it become less available? Like, how do those companies have to adapt when, I have no idea of the math here, but you might see a 20 or 30% increase in canceled bookings to specific destinations?
Yeah, and that is where, my point on understanding how are people responding to these hazards is really important, because that's what insurers need to know. Well, if we have a heat wave of 40 degrees in city X, what percentage of people, and maybe even by market segment, seniors or people with young children, what percentage of them are actually canceling? Well, then they can decide, their premiums based on that sort of thing. And without that kind of information, they can't do the pricing properly, and they just won't offer the product. Tourism hasn't made use of, there's weather insurance, and there's a product called basically weather derivatives that if a climate event happens, you don't have to demonstrate you lost anything. You just get a payout. So if it rained 3 out of 7 days of your Caribbean holiday, you would get a payout regardless of whether you stayed or went home or that sort of thing. So there's a lot of potential in the sector, but without understanding, how are tourists responding, or what are their preferences and what are they willing to pay for some of these things, we can't really get that weather insurance for tourism priced properly to make sure that it's actually going to be offered.
How can we predict any of this stuff with certainty in this kind of industry right now anyway? I mean, we've also had a lot of discussion this summer of just how unpredictable, even by the standards of climate models, I guess, this year has been, and how things look like they are picking up the pace faster than scientists maybe thought they would. And, how could you even model what the tourism industry will look like 2 or 3 years from now in specific locations?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. And we've seen that the last couple of summers, as climate scientists, when we saw 40 degrees in Seattle and Victoria, and then the following summer in London, England, nobody thought that was, feasible. Certainly not in the 2020s. We thought you might see those types of extremes in the decades ahead, depending on what kind of emission futures and climate change actually played out. So yes, this summer, the sort of widespread nature of heat waves and fire culmination in multiple continents, I think has really galvanized attention of the media, but I think of the tourism industry as well. And so I'm hopeful that they do respond in an active way, in the same way they did with COVID. They set up task forces to understand what the COVID impact was, what its responses could be. And we've always told them you need something similar to that for climate change, because you don't know when it's going to rear its head. And I think this summer was hopefully that critical mass that we can put some of the great intelligence we have, both in the private sector, governments, and in the academic world, put our heads together and try to do as best as we can to understand what those risks look like, knowing the uncertainties that you pointed out are still going to be there. This year, because of El Nino and some other changes compounding what was happening from a global climate change perspective, might be a bit of an anomaly. Some are thinking next year could be equally bad, but then it might sort of smoothen out for a little while, hopefully, for everyone. But give us that time to catch our breath and hopefully understand these things a lot better so that we can grapple with some of that uncertainty.
So far, we've talked about, the impacts of extreme events and extreme weather on specific locations. What about just the future as the temperature increases? And I think about this. I was in Barcelona more than a decade ago at this time of year in like late August. And, it was 40 degrees and everybody was baking, and a lot of the older buildings didn't have air conditioning, and it was unpleasant. I mean, it was fine, but it was unpleasant at times. I can't imagine what this time of year would be like in those places in Europe now and in 5 or 10 years from now. What happens to those places that are just going to keep getting hotter, that we typically, go to as an escape from the cold or to get some sun, but are going to be uncomfortable beyond that?
I had the same experience in parts of Italy and some places in the UK as well. I mean, the infrastructure is not built for heat, but in Italy, it should be. But my wife and I were at a resort. There was no air conditioning. There wasn't even fans. So while they had the shades on the outside to keep the sunlight out, you were baking in there and you could not cool that place off. That has to change. There's discomfort, but then there's health risk.
Right.
The people that are staying there. And we're seeing that sort of threshold from discomfort and sort of annoyance to actual health impact, heat-related illness. We see that a lot in parts of some of those European destinations. Places like the Acropolis do not have shade, so you've got people queuing up by the hundreds, climbing up, on a mountain. in the blaring sun. The Red Cross had set up water stations and stuff to help them. But that has to change. It has to be that kind of planning, and it has to be fit within the local aesthetic, obviously, and the cultural heritage that you're seeing. But you have to provide people a safe way to see those things. And the same with accommodations. We did an analysis of over 800,000 hotel properties around the world and how many of them had air conditioning. And it was about 80%. But some of that 20% or even more were in really warm destinations where you would expect the air conditioning to be. And of course, that assumes the air conditioning functions. In some parts of the world with electricity. Sometimes the grid goes down. So there is a lot of adaptation or resilience building that tourism will have to do so that they can continue to host people in a safe way. Where those thresholds of deterring tourists from coming is a really interesting question. People have gone to Athens and Rome and Venice and places where it's going to be hot and discomfortable, particularly in the summer season. So some are flexible enough that more and more can go in the shoulder seasons. But places like the Caribbean Tourism Organization asked that very question of me and said, are we going to see a point where people don't want to come here because it's too hot? And the good news was in winter, that wasn't going to be the case. So Canadians will still want to escape to a sunshine destination. The Caribbean will still be great for that. Mm-hmm. Where it does affect them, though, is there is a relationship between how many Canadians book and what our weather looks like. So we have something called a weather severity index. And when it's high, and you can think of that in our area, when it's gloomy and you've got tons of snow and a cold came in November, that pushes bookings, right? And so as that winter severity, the length of winter goes down, there is less and less a push factor for Canadians or people in the northern US states to go to warm weather destinations. And we can see that if you're in the mid sort of states in the US or if you're in the US South, the number of people going to those sunshine getaways is far fewer as a percentage than say, Canadians.
What do you not know about the future of tourism in this era that you would really like to find out? This is my last question. I want to know, what keeps you up at night or what you're incredibly curious about in this space, which, as you've pointed out, is just rapidly evolving.
So there are real knowledge gaps that we would love to help resolve in order to help destinations, governments, and businesses prepare for some of these things and become more resilient themselves. I mentioned tourism doesn't do a great job of learning from some of these extreme events that we get. These are missed learning opportunities, and we keep sort of reminding of that, understand what is the economic impact to tourism. What did you do and what worked, what didn't, use those lessons in other parts of the world. So that is something we really want to do more of, understand those early impacts, because they are, we're just seeing the front end of the wave. We're going to see more summers like this. We're going to see more severe ones than this in the future. So we know that's coming. The other big challenge that tourism has that we do some work on is how can tourism be part of the low carbon economy of mid-century? So tourism is going to have to, and it has that target as a global sector. It wants to be net zero by 2050, as Canada and many other countries have committed to do the same sort of thing. But right now, tourism policy is not at all aligned with climate policy in Canada. And in most countries, to be frank, Canada still, markets to attract tourists from the highest emission tourists from Japan or China and those sorts of markets. So there's that real disconnect of, hey, we want to decarbonize tourism, but we're trying to seek out and grow the markets that are actually the most carbon inefficient, when we should be looking at, well, who are the most carbon efficient markets? Let's do more to attract them and build our tourism industry around those. And COVID taught us there's a whole lot to see in our own backyard, let alone our own province or our region. And we discovered some of those things under COVID. And a lot of that closer to home tourism is actually, very consistent with what we would look at a low carbon tourism industry to look like in the future. So there's some good learnings there as well.
Daniel, thanks for this. It's a fascinating look inside a changing industry.
Absolutely. Lots going on.
Daniel Scott at Waterloo University. That was The Big Story. For more, head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can find all of our episodes on the climate crisis, and this summer there have been an awful lot of them right there. Just scroll to the bottom, type climate in the search bar, and be amazed/depressed. You choose. You can also leave us feedback. We'd love to hear from you, especially about our climate coverage. It's important to us to get it right, so all feedback is appreciated. The easy way to do that is to find us on Twitter at TheBigStoryFPN, or email us, hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or call us, of course, and leave us a voicemail, 416-935-5935. If you're listening to this episode in a podcast player that lets you rate or review this podcast and you haven't done it yet, what are you waiting for? Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.